Hello, and welcome to Healing Circle Stories, a space where we share the real, raw experiences of nurses and healthcare workers navigating the emotional impact of this profession. I'm Gabe, your nurse ally, and today we're talking about something that too many of us have faced but rarely discuss: workplace violence and the weight it leaves behind. In this episode, you'll hear the story of Elizabeth, a seasoned emergency department nurse who was assaulted by a patient while simply doing her job. But the hardest part wasn't the physical injuries, it was coming back to work, facing the whispers, the doubt, and the fear that followed. This is more than just a story about one violent incident. It's about resilience, the emotional toll of being a second victim, and the power of breaking the silence. If you've ever felt alone after a difficult patient encounter, if you've ever questioned your strength after a traumatic event, this story is for you. And if you've never been in this situation, I encourage you to listen because chances are someone on your team has. Let's start the conversation and build a culture that truly supports one another. Stay with me and let's walk through Elizabeth's journey together. 15 years in the emergency department had taught me how to handle just about anything: code blues, combative patients, heartbreaking losses. I had learned how to hold my ground, how to de escalate, how to keep my emotions in check no matter how chaotic things got. I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong. It was a busy Friday night shift, the kind where the waiting room was packed with patients slumped in chairs, some wrapped in blankets, others pacing restlessly. The charge nurses board was a mess: strokes, chest pains, overdoses, and a handful of psychiatric holds waiting for placement. I barely had time to take a breath between rapid assessments, medication pushes, and the constant beeping of monitors. Then, EMS rolled in with a middle aged man who was thrashing violently against the gurney restraints. The paramedics looked exhausted, one rubbing his shoulder where the patient had clearly tried to bite him. He was found wandering the streets, one of them said, keeping a firm hand on the man's shoulder. Possibly meth, maybe bath salts. He's been screaming at things that aren't there, super paranoid. We had to restrain him for transport. I took a deep breath, already feeling the tension in the air. Patients like this were unpredictable. Sometimes a calming voice could bring them back to reality. Other times, no amount of reassurance mattered. The patient was drenched in sweat, his chest heaving, his pupils were blown, darting wildly around the room, as if he was seeing things none of us could. His hands flexed against the soft restraints, testing them. Every muscle in his body looked wound tight, coiled like a spring ready to snap. Still, I followed protocol. I kept my voice low, my movements slow. "Hey there, sir. My name is Elizabeth. We're here to help you." He mumbled something, a string of half-formed words I couldn't make out. I glanced at his vitals on the monitor. Tachycardic, blood pressure climbing. He was in full-blown stimulant-induced psychosis. "Let's get a set of vitals," I said to the tech, gesturing for her to grab the blood pressure cuff. The moment I reached for his arm, everything changed. His entire body jerked, eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. His expression twisted into something primal: rage, fear, confusion. Before I could react, he broke free of one restraint. A fist came out of nowhere. The first punch landed squarely on my cheekbone, the force snapping my head back. A bright explosion of pain burst behind my eyes. Then came the second hit, hard and fast, slamming into my ribs. I stumbled, my back hitting the wall, the breath ripped from my lungs. The room spun. My ears rang with the sound of shouting, voices I couldn't quite process yet. Then came a third blow. This time, I felt it in my mouth, a sharp sting, the unmistakable taste of blood filling the space beneath my tongue. I tried to move, to react, to get my hands up to defend myself, but my body felt frozen in place. In my mind, I was yelling, but no words came out. My legs felt like lead. The world blurred at the edges. Suddenly, hands grabbed me, pulling me away. Security stormed in, tackling the patient, pinning him down as he continued thrashing. My coworkers were shouting, their voices urgent and frantic. "Get her out of here! Elizabeth, can you hear me? Jesus, she's bleeding. Someone call the doc." I felt someone guiding me, my legs moving on autopilot. My body was buzzing. Pain, adrenaline, something deeper I couldn't name yet. My lip throbbed. My ribs ached with every breath. My face felt like it had been hit with a brick. I was sat down in a wheelchair, though I didn't remember when. The charge nurse, eyes wide with concern, crouched in front of me. "Elizabeth, you with me?" I nodded numbly. A doctor I barely recognized knelt beside me, shining a penlight in my eyes. Pupils reactive. "How's your vision?" Blurred. My eyes were still ringing. My mouth felt too full, swollen, the inside of my cheek torn where my teeth had cut into it. I forced words out. I'm fine. I wasn't fine. Someone pressed an ice pack into my hand, guiding it into my cheek. The coolness barely registered against the burning heat of the swelling already forming. Someone else said, "She needs a CT." I shook my head. "No, just give me a second." Everything in me wanted to get up, to shake this off, to prove I wasn't as shaken as I felt. But my body betrayed me. My hands trembled, my breathing too shallow. I had been hit before. Patients had grabbed me, scratched me, even thrown punches that I had dodged. But this was different. The doctor insisted on an evaluation, and I was taken to the back. The x-rays confirmed bruised ribs, but no fractures. A minor concussion, a split lip that needed sutures. I sat there numbly, letting the residents stitch me up, staring past them at the fluorescent lights overhead. My body would heal, I knew that, but something else had cracked inside me, something I wasn't sure how to fix. The physical wounds healed faster than I expected. The bruising faded, my lips scabbed over, and the headaches gradually lessened. But something deeper lingered, something I couldn't shake. The first few days after the attack, I told myself I was fine. I tried to push it down, to move forward like nothing had happened. I reassured my coworkers, my manager, even myself. I'm okay. It could have been worse. This happens in the ED. But deep down, I knew I wasn't okay. I felt it in the way my heart pounded whenever I heard raised voices, in the way my body tensed at the sound of restraints tightening. I started second-guessing my movements, hesitating before approaching certain patients. For the first time in my career, I was afraid. Then came the whispers. The first time I noticed them was in the break room. Two nurses huddled near the coffee machine, their voices low. When I walked in, the conversation stopped abruptly. One of them gave me a quick, forced smile, then turned back to stirring her coffee as if I wasn't there. The next day, I caught another conversation in the hallway. "She should have seen it coming. I heard she just stood there and took it. I mean, she's been doing this for years. How did she not react faster?" It was like a punch to the gut. I had spent my entire career proving myself, showing that I could handle the pressure, that I could hold my own in the chaos of the ED. And yet, in a single moment, I had become a topic of gossip. My years of experience reduced to a story passed around between shifts. I wanted to defend myself, to tell them that it happened so fast, that I hadn't frozen. I had simply been blindsided. But no matter how much I wanted to, I didn't say a word. Instead, I withdrew. I stopped lingering in the break room. I avoided conversations in the hallway. I buried myself in my work, hoping that if I just kept pushing forward, it would all go away. But it didn't. The first time, I had to step into another agitated patient's room. My hands shook. My heart pounded in my ears. I kept my feet planted, forced myself to breathe, but my body screamed at me to run. I hesitated, just for a second. It was enough for another nurse to notice. "Are you okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed. I forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine." I wasn't. That one moment of hesitation stuck with me. What if it had been a real emergency? What if my hesitation had put someone else in danger? Doubt crept in. Maybe I wasn't as strong as I thought. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this anymore. One night, after an exhausting shift, I sat alone in the break room, staring at my untouched cup of coffee. My body ached, but it was nothing compared to the weight pressing against my chest. I had never felt this alone before. "I know what you're going through." I looked up. Mark, one of the charge nurses, was pulling up a chair beside me. He didn't look at me with pity, just understanding. "I was assaulted by a patient 5 years ago," he said, his voice low. "Cracked two ribs, but the hardest part wasn't the pain. It was coming back." I blinked. Mark had always seemed unshakable. I had never heard this story before. "The way people look at you, the way they talk, like you're weak, like you let it happen," he continued. "I let it get to me for a long time. Thought maybe I wasn't cut out for this anymore." I swallowed hard. "Yeah," I admitted. It was the first real word I had spoken about it. He nodded. "But you know what? That's BS." His voice was steady. "We work in a war zone. We're trained for a lot, but we're not invincible. You didn't do anything wrong, Elizabeth, and you sure as hell aren't alone." His words hit harder than I expected. The tightness in my chest, the weight I had been carrying, it didn't disappear, but for the first time, it felt lighter. That conversation changed something in me. I wasn't alone. I had spent so much time believing that what had happened to me was a reflection of my own failure, that I should have been quicker, stronger, more prepared. But as I sat there listening to Mark, I realized something. This wasn't just my story. This had happened before, and it would happen again. And not because we were weak or because we weren't good enough, but because we were human. Because we worked in an environment where violence had become an expectation, something we were just supposed to endure. I started talking about it, first with Mark, then with a few other nurses who had been through the same thing. And I realized there were more of us than I thought. So many nurses who had been assaulted, shaken, left to deal with it in silence. Nurses who had blamed themselves, who had questioned whether they still belonged here. I refused to stay silent anymore. I started speaking up in staff meetings. At first, my voice wavered, my hands gripped too tightly around my notepad, but I spoke anyways. I talked about the assault, about how I had been left to deal with the aftermath alone, not because my team didn't care, but because no one knew what to say, because we had never been given the space to talk about these things. I pushed for better security training, for debriefings after incidents, for real support for staff who had been assaulted. No more just shake it off mentality. No more whispering about the victim instead of addressing the real problem. I made it a point to check in on newer nurses, to pay attention to those who seemed withdrawn, who looked like they were carrying their own invisible wounds. Sometimes I'd find them sitting in the break room, staring at their coffee the same way I had, lost in the same kind of heaviness. I know what you're going through, I would tell them, and I meant it. I wasn't the same nurse I was before the attack. I still carried the fear, but I had learned to carry it differently. It didn't own me anymore. It didn't define me. The whispers didn't matter anymore. I knew my worth. I knew my strength, and I wasn't alone. I never had been. Wow, amazing story. Elizabeth's story is one that unfortunately resonates with far too many nurses and healthcare professionals. We come into this profession to help, to heal, and to make a difference. But what happens when we're the ones who get hurt, physically, emotionally, and mentally? What happens when the very environment where we dedicate our lives to saving others becomes a place where we no longer feel safe? Her experience sheds light on something we don't talk about enough: the reality of workplace violence in healthcare. It's not just about the moment of the attack, it's about everything that comes after: the whispers, the doubt, the feeling of isolation. And that's what makes this story so powerful, because for so long, nurses who have been assaulted have been left to deal with it in silence, carrying that weight alone. Here are some key takeaways from Elizabeth's story that I want us to remember here. Number one, workplace violence in healthcare is real and is more common than we acknowledge. We like to think of hospitals as safe spaces, but the truth is, violence happens here every day. It's often brushed off as just part of the job, but it shouldn't be. No one should have come to work wondering if today is the day they'll be the next target. Number two, the emotional toll lasts far beyond the physical injuries. Elizabeth's bruises and concussion healed, but the fear, the self doubt, and the way people treated her afterward, that lingered. We need to recognize that being assaulted doesn't just leave physical scars. It shakes your confidence, your trust in your team, and sometimes even your sense of belonging in this profession. Number three, silence fuels the problem. What made Elizabeth feel most alone wasn't the attack, it was the way people reacted afterward: the whispers, the avoidance, the assumption that she somehow should have seen it coming. Instead of supporting each other, we often turn away from these conversations because they make us uncomfortable. But healing starts when we acknowledge the problem and stand together instead of leaving people to navigate their trauma alone. Number four, speaking up creates change. Elizabeth found strength in sharing her story. When she broke her silence, she realized she wasn't alone. There were so many other nurses who had gone through similar experiences, and through her advocacy, she started pushing for better security, real debriefings, and actual support for healthcare workers who experience workplace violence. And lastly, you are not weak if you struggle after a traumatic event. Let me say that again: you are not weak. Trauma affects all of us differently, and having an emotional reaction to violence does not make you less of a nurse. If you're finding it hard to go back to work, if you're hesitating in certain situations, if you feel like you've lost your confidence, it doesn't mean you're not cut out for this job. It means you're human, and healing takes time. So, what do we do with a story like Elizabeth's? We learn from it. We change how we talk about workplace violence. We push for real solutions: better security, stronger policies, and more support for nurses and staff who go through these experiences. And most importantly, we make sure that no one feels like they have to go through it alone. If you or someone you know has been through something similar, I want you to know this: you are not alone. Your feelings are valid, and there is a community here ready to listen and support you. Thank you for being part of Healing Circle Stories. Let's keep the conversation going, because the more we talk about this, the more we can change it. Please make sure to like and subscribe.